Today I'll be showing you how to make a Puerto Rican pernil with a super crunchy skin. But first, let's start with the ingredients that we're going to need. The most important one is this one, the pernil. The pernil is usually made with a pork shoulder or a pork butt with the bone in, and most importantly with the skin on. The skin is one of the best parts of the pernil because of how crunchy, bubbly, and delicious it gets. In Puerto Rico, we call it cuero or cuerito. And trust me, it is the best part of this recipe. Now for the marinade, we're only gonna need a few ingredients. First, we have 1/4 cup of vegetable oil, but you could really use your favorite oil like olive oil or even coconut oil. Then we have 2 tablespoons of salt. We also need 2 tablespoons of adobo, 1 tablespoon of dry oregano, 3 teaspoons of sazon con achote or 2 packets, 1 teaspoon of ground thyme, and 3 garlic cloves. Remember to preheat your oven to 250 degrees so it could be hot by the time you're done seasoning. In a jar, plate, or bowl, add your oil and your dry ingredients. Now it is important to mention that almost every family has their own seasoning version for the pernil. Some people like to add sofrito for flavor, others like to add achote oil, but this is just a matter of preference. If you want to add those ingredients too, I have a recipe for sofrito and aceite de achote on the blog, so go and check it out. Once you added all your dry ingredients to the oil and the garlic, give it a good mix. If it is easier for you, you can make this marinade on a blender or a food processor. You can even double this batch of marinade and save it in your fridge to use later to season your meats. When you prepare the marinade by hand, you'll notice that it has a very chunky-like texture, but if it's made in a blender, it will have a smoother feel. But it really doesn't matter. Either way is good. Now we need to flip the pork skin down. What we want to do here is poke the pernil a few times to help the marinade penetrate more. I usually put the knife in until I feel the bone, but you must be careful because we do not want to go through the pork skin. Here I did about 8 cuts, but you can make more or less depending on how big your pork is. We now need an oven-safe pan that is big enough to fit the meat so we can cook the pork. In this same pan, we will marinate the meat. Now, start by adding a couple of tablespoons of the seasonings on top of the pork. In the beginning, I like to use a spoon to spread around the seasoning mix. If you prefer, you can even use a brush for this. I season the skinless part of the meat first because this is the part that will go at the bottom when it's time to cook. After I spread the seasoning as much as possible with the spoon, I go in with my clean hands. Now, with my clean hands, I try to get in all the creases of the meat. I also go ahead and try to push the seasoning in there. Now, if you're one of those people who really doesn't like touching the meat, you can always use gloves. Right now, it might look like the pernil has too much seasoning, but a good part of it will slide off while the meat sweats and cooks. Some people like to cut the skin of the pernil off so they could marinate in between, but I don't, because I want the cuerito to have a juicy, thin layer of fat so it won't become so hard. For me, the perfect pork skin or cuerito has a fluffy, crispy texture. Now we flip the pork shoulder and add the rest of the marinade on top. Make sure you lift the pork skin and spread some of the seasonings in there too. A question I often get is how long I have to marinate the pork, and the answer to that is really up to you. I hardly ever marinate my pork, but you can marinate it overnight if you like. If the pan you're using has a lid, then use it. Since I can't use the lid of this pan, I will cover the meat with 2 large pieces of foil. This helps to keep the steam and the moisture in. Plus, it helps to slowly cook the meat. I now place the pernil in a preheated oven for 4 hours. A good question to answer is how to know for how long to cook the pernil. In my case, since I want to make the pernil very tender, I leave it in about an hour per pound. But if you just want meat to be cooked, not necessarily pull apart meat, then 40 minutes per pound is enough. After the pernil has been in the oven for 4 hours at 250 degrees, we need to remove the foil. The first thing that you'll notice is the pool of juices in the bottom of the pan. We want to save all this precious liquid in a jar or bowl. Do not discard it. This is basically liquid gold for food. but you must be careful because it will be hot and your pernil can fall off while trying to do this. If you can't lift your pan, then just use a spoon to get most, not all, of the liquid out. With all of this liquid, you can make arroz con gandule, arroz con habichuela, or even a gravy. You won't even have to add any extra fat because it's all here. Now raise the oven temperature to 350 degrees and cook it for 3 hours. Then remove any big chunks of seasonings to avoid them from burning. Then raise the oven temperature again to 450 degrees and cook for 15 minutes to make the cuerito super crispy. This is the sound a good cuerito makes. Some people like to score the pernil skin into a checker pattern to be able to cut the cuerito more easily, but I like to leave the cuerito intact and cut the pieces however I want after. Now the first thing to remove is a small piece of super crunchy and delicious pork skin so you could taste how good it is. Look how crispy it is. It is honestly the best part of making a Puerto Rican style pernil. But this is not a Puerto Rican exclusive. Many Latin countries also cook their pork this way, just with different seasonings. This is basically pulled pork but seasoned with the flavors of the Caribbean. Now here you see how tender the meat is, how easily we could grab a piece. It is juicy and delicious. Now just listen to the sound the knife makes when cutting the cuerito. This is how I like to separate the cuerito from the meat. I like to take it off in big chunks and then everyone can take whatever piece they like. You could leave the meat in your pan, but I always like to get a plate or a bowl to serve the meat in. I first like to remove all the cuero, then start getting the meat off until I leave nothing but the bone. The meat will come off easily and it's pretty easy to do. Now you see how there will be some of the juices and fat of the pork left on the pan. What I always like to do is soak some of the meat in there because it doesn't matter what we do, the inside of the pernil always has a little less flavor. So these drippings really add flavor to that meat. Plus, it is a great way to keep the pernil moist. You can even leave the meat in there if you like. Trust me, it is really good. Now this pork recipe right here is what you'll see served at most Puerto Rican parties and holidays, especially during Navidad, where it's almost always served with arroz con gandule, just like the one you see right here. The leftovers are great to serve in sandwiches or even baked potatoes. Now look how delicious this pernil with arroz con gandule looks. Make this recipe on your next Thanksgiving meal, birthday, or even wedding. Remember that the Printable recipe can be found in foodmetamorphosis.com. Link in the description below. Buen provecho.